Right, it's a pleasure and honour to have been invited to speak here about using conventions to bring about change. I'm going to focus on the Global Biodiversity Conventions that have been designed to get intergovernmental agreement on minimum standards for nature conservation and the accompanying ongoing process of regular meetings to support their implementation. I aim to shed light on some of the mysteries of the Biodiversity Convention process, which may appear to be no more than an endless circuit of international meetings packed with jet-setting civil servants and diplomats, backed by NGOs and experts, talking at length in an alphabet soup of acronyms about apparently no more than the position of a comma in an abstruse text. Hopefully, by the end of the talk, you'll have more of an insight into their relevance to what you're trying to achieve, so that more of us can use them to fulfill their potential as a tool for saving nature. Although I work for the RSPB and usually speak on behalf of BirdLife in international fora, this is a personal perspective based on, scarily, 30 years of engagement in the MEA, the Multilateral Environmental Agreement game. It's a perspective forged especially by using the MEAs to get the best deal for migratory birds. This is reasonable because migratory species conservation was the subject of the first ever international environmental treaty signed in 1886 to conserve salmon along the Rhine. Where species regularly cross national boundaries, their conservation depends on all countries agreeing to do their bit. Till the war drum throbbed no longer and the battle flags were furled in the Parliament of Man, the federation of the world, there the common sense of most shall hold a fretful realm in awe, and the kindly earth shall slumber, lapped in universal law. As long ago as 1835, Tennyson, in his poem Locksley Hall, foresaw the establishment of the United Nations at the end of the Second World War, superseding the League of Nations formed after World War I. Whilst there's a clear proximate need for biodiversity conventions to support governments to deliver conservation of our shared natural heritage, sometimes they ultimately sign up to these things because nature is seen as a soft way to foster international cooperation in the interests of world peace and economic links. This is worth bearing in mind when encouraging governments to comply with them. So what exactly is a biodiversity convention? It's a legally binding agreement between at least 3 states with a goal of biodiversity conservation. Once a contracting party ratifies the convention, it must comply with it. So which are the main global biodiversity conventions? CBD, the Biodiversity Convention, is the big daddy of them all, although really it's like a stepfather because it came along after the children. Originating at the Rio Summit in 1932, it provides a framework for the other conventions, and to be honest, politically, it's the only show in town. Compare participation in recent Conference of the Parties, or COPs. Less than 1,000 delegates were at the last COPs of the Ramsar Convention and CMS, the Convention on Migratory Species, whereas about 14,000 attended the CBD COP in 2012. And every nation in the world except the US is a party. It's where the relatively big bucks for conservation are to be found. For years, it did seem just to be a diplomatic talking shop, but now has moved into the implementation phase. The main mechanism for delivering national implementation of the CBD, and in theory all the other biodiversity conventions, is the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, or NBSAPs. All countries are supposed to be developing a second generation of these, in line with the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity agreed in 2010. Almost all the other conventions arose from the 1972 Stockholm Conference. So far, they probably have a much better track record of making positive, measurable difference on the ground for biodiversity than CBD. Partly this is because they have a 20-year head start, and partly it's because they're more specific in their goals, having been developed and implemented mainly by technical folk, whereas diplomats got involved in CBD. I've also added in the Berne Convention, which helps implement the global conventions in Europe, and was the starting point actually for the EU nature directives. One of the great things that the CBD has achieved was the agreement in 2010 of the 20 HE targets, which countries are supposed to meet by 2020. For the first time, they provide the world with a kind of common currency for biodiversity. The NBSAPs are meant to help countries achieve them. Then last year, the UN General Assembly adopted the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, to which the HE targets contribute. It's really the SDGs that have the main political resonance with governments now. After all, they were adopted by heads of state, but the HE targets only at Environment Ministry level. The one other potentially key acronym to add is BES, and you heard all about that from Lynn yesterday. So, you may well be saying, what have all these acronyms got to do with my ecological objectives? Well, you can doubtless continue along quite happily without them, still achieving useful things for biodiversity. However, to do so, you could sometimes be missing a trick. Everything we are trying to do is probably encompassed by the HE targets and SDGs, and there are mechanisms or potential mechanisms within the conventions to help achieve each of these. If you want governmental support for delivering species and habitat conservation, you're likely to be more successful if you can map it through to its contribution to the relevant SDGs. So, there are two main ways you can use conventions to bring about change. Most important is to use the existing provisions of a convention to ensure national implementation, and so delivery of biodiversity on the ground. For example, there are lots of tools already adopted by the conventions that you may find useful. These include guidance on all sorts of issues such as preventing poisoning or minimizing damage to birds from the energy sector. But here I'll focus on how we can influence conventions to update their priorities and develop internationally adopted tools to support national implementation, as this is what I do on a daily basis. As I talk, perhaps you can consider whether you could input to or use the convention process, either directly or through someone like me who specialises in engaging with them, either from the governmental or the non-governmental sector. So what is the institutional framework through which we can influence convention decisions? The Conference of the Parties, or COP, is where governmental representatives, usually from environment ministries, the responsible officer being known as the national focal point, regularly, every few years, gather to make decisions, usually by consensus. During the intersessional period, subgroups meet essentially to prepare for the next COP. So, for example, in CMS, Convention on Migratory Species, the Scientific Council meets a couple of times between COPs to prepare the technical detail of discussions. Likewise, the Standing Committee meets to approve the outputs of the Scientific Council and develop resolutions of a more financial and administrative nature. In addition, working groups deal with specific issues. All this and the day-to-day business of the convention is organised by the Secretariat. Only governments can propose and adopt decisions. NGOs and other expert observers and advisors are welcome to participate to various degrees depending on the convention. Given the extra capacity of such organisations, beyond that of environment ministries, which, as we heard from Ian Boyd, tend to suffer high staff turnover as well as inadequate resources, they often provide a lot of the technical and policy vision and content of a convention and its soul. So to take me as an example, apart from the avian technical officer at the CMS Secretariat, I'm the only person in the world who works full-time on migratory species policy globally. So I'd be failing if I wasn't showing a bit of leadership in CMS. Some parties with low capacity even ask NGOs to represent them in negotiations. For example, here's Paul Matiku, who began life as a field ornithologist in Kenya. Now, as the CEO of the wonderful Nature Kenya, he's risen to such a trusted position that at a recent CBD COP, he was not speaking just on behalf of Nature Kenya, nor only the Kenyan government, but on behalf of all of the African governments on the most sensitive issue of all, which is resource mobilization. So I'll now go through the four main categories of implementation with which we can engage to help effect positive change. I'll focus on the italicised items where we can input internationally. The most basic provision of any convention is that parties must ensure their national legislation is aligned with it. But it's the job of the COP to develop the convention text further as needed. We can contribute to that, for example, by ensuring conventions' lists of protected species are up to date. To illustrate the way it can work, take the Far Eastern curlew, which BirdLife uplisted to vulnerable on the red list, IUCN red list in 2010. We supported the Philippines government to get it added to CMS Appendix 1 at the CMS COP the following year, and now Australia is developing a flyway action plan for the species to be intergovernmentally adopted next year. Perhaps the biggest challenge for governments is ensuring compliance with the law, such as the preventing killing of protected species. Conventions can help meet these challenges, for example, by providing guidance, facilitating sharing of experience, so each country doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. So at the CMS COP in 2011, parties agreed that poisoning was a major global threat to migratory birds, and they established a working group of experts that developed guidelines on how to prevent the main threats. These were adopted at the last COP in 2014, including agreement to phase out use of lead ammunition by the next COP in 2017. Not an easy thing to negotiate. Similarly, a CMS task force has been established to work with the energy sector to implement CMS guidance on wind energy and power lines. All parties to a convention must regularly produce national reports on how they've been implementing it. There's a lot more that could be done to make these powerful tools to facilitate implementation as well as just to monitor it, but I don't have time to cover that here. Finally, there are cases where parties are clearly failing to comply with a convention, for example, by allowing destruction of protected areas. Unlike the EU nature directives, the conventions have limited powers of enforcement. Lacking strong sanctions, they work largely through peer pressure. To be honest, they are not a lot of use for governments that don't care about biodiversity and don't care what the international community think about them, but luckily most do. But some conventions do have compliance mechanisms through which they can undertake a mission at the invitation of the country with the problem to use an international perspective to try and solve it, where national efforts have failed, unlike in Sarah's superb story from Kenya. For example, next month there will be a convention mission to Iceland following a complaint from BirdLife Iceland to help address the Forest Ministry-backed government policy of subsidising afforestation of the lowlands, where many of the UK's wintering waterbirds breed, the conservation of which is the responsibility of the Environment Ministry. Evidence of the impacts of such perverse incentives and other threats is the kind of thing where ecologists' input really is needed. The nature directives were largely enacted to comply with the conventions, and being more strongly legally binding than the conventions to some extent supersede them. But conventions can encourage parties to deliver certain conservation objectives in ways that the EU process can't. Take the case of the North American ruddy duck. Here in the UK, it escaped from wildfowl collections, establishing a population of a few thousand pairs. That would have been fine, but they kept making their way to the Mediterranean and hybridizing with the globally threatened white-headed duck, to the chagrin of the likes of the Spanish government that had been spending millions on conservation measures for the white-headed duck. The UK needed to eradicate the ruddy duck, but the animal rights lobby and many bird watchers were vehemently against, to the extent of bomb threats. A Berne Convention resolution provided the counterbalance to this, enabling the minister to agree to the eradication programme. And it was actually a savvy DEFRA official that tipped off BirdLife to get that resolution process up and running. The equivalent applied actually to the Iceland case. It's cosy, but in a good way. Furthermore, because conventions are less politically charged and bureaucratic than the EU, they tend to be better for it to develop policies. Once they're safely adopted by the convention, the EU, which is a party to the convention, then has to transpose it into law or policy. So it's only because the Berne Convention, in line with CBD, adopted in 2014 its European Strategy on Invasive Alien Species, which it developed through an expert group, that 10 years later, the EU adopted its own legally binding regulation on invasive alien species. Also, conventions enable the EU to show leadership in supporting countries beyond the EU to develop equivalent national legislation and to conserve biodiversity which they share with the EU, such as migratory species. So if you want to bring about change, why bother to engage with a convention process rather than, for example, just working at a national level? One of the main benefits, for example, for an organisation like BirdLife, is that instead of each national partner individually having to work with their government to develop and advocate a policy, colleagues acting globally on their behalf can, in the course of a few intense weeks, admittedly interspersed by months of preparation and consultation, get all the governments at the COP to agree to something at one time. Of course, then they have to implement it nationally, but they can be reminded of their COP commitment when they get home and supported to put it into practice. Conventions have the enormously valuable role of building a common agenda in which all formally agree on the priority species and sites for conservation action, the main threats facing them, and how to address those threats. In seeking support for your research or conservation action, it's often worth mentioning the intergovernmental legal imperative to conserve biodiversity. Clever NGOs and clever environment ministries use the conventions to help them win political arguments with other, often stronger ministries, sectors or lobby groups, as in the Ruddy Duck and Iceland examples. Finally, taking people along to a COP is good for intensive on-the-job capacity building on advocacy as well as working on conventions. So how might you go about engaging with conventions given that they have the potential to be among the more useful tools for, in particular, supporting environment ministries to fulfill their obligations to save nature, especially outside the EU? If you are working on issues that are preoccupying the conventions by scanning what is on their agendas and when, in other words, identifying the policy windows, you may find it's applied more quickly. For example, at this meeting, Aldina from the University of East Anglia approached me to ask if any of their research on migratory birds would be useful to the convention. She mentioned some exciting work that they're doing on rollers. Fortuitously, CMS is aiming to complete a flyway action plan for the roller by October next year, and so we'll now stitch her team into the process. She also wanted to discuss what additional research was needed. Her approach was very refreshing music to my ears. On the other hand, if you're working on an issue that you think would benefit from concerted intergovernmental effort that isn't yet on a convention agenda, how do you get it added? For that, you need to bear in mind the political opportunities. Take one of the major threats currently facing migratory birds, the destruction of the Arabian coastal habitats. The next COP of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands is hosted by Dubai in 2018, so that provides a timely opportunity to put it on the international agenda. Ian Boyd summarised many of the approaches that are also needed if you are personally to engage in conventions work. And actually, Elizabeth, on your social things, you itemised the way that we work as well. I would emphasise in particular the importance of building alliances and trust, continuity, optimism and patience. Having said all that, the thing about conventions work is that it's all completely pointless, so much hot air and wasted carbon without national implementation to turn all the fine words negotiated at the COP into saved species and habitats on the ground. There are so many different approaches to conservation, all of which are needed and all of which have the potential to benefit from biodiversity conventions. Sometimes in the conservation community, there's a tendency towards insularity and short-sightedness, leading to fragmentation of effort, both within and between institutions. Some look down at the incomprehensible culture of other approaches. Oh, those scientists, all they care about is their publication rate. Oh, those policy wonks, what a load of waffle. Oh, those comms people forever dumbing it down. But all those approaches are needed, and they need to work synergistically together with everyone clear about their niche and how to maximise their impact on the ground per unit effort if we are to achieve the dramatic acceleration in effectiveness needed to reach our conservation goals. Generally, in conservation, collaborations are a good thing. The more people who are committed to a shared objective, who clearly understand their role in achieving it and are well coordinated, the more chance of achieving it. We need to increase the ambition of our vision. Surely our task is at least as urgent and important as that of the physicists who managed to organise themselves to mobilise the resources, deliver and use the Large Hadron Collider. For that, we need to find a common language, no matter what Susan Owen says. The consilience described by E.O. Wilson between the various conservation cultures, from the researchers to the policy people, or at least deploy interpreters, closing the gap so each community understands what the other needs from them. Actually, I see the David Attenborough building as an inverse Tower of Babel that can achieve this for the 10 cohabiting institutions and beyond. It's all set to be an ecosystem which celebrates and capitalizes on the diversity of approaches, ensuring that they work in concert and not competition. Anyhow, in conclusion, I believe the biodiversity conventions present a huge and relatively untapped resource to facilitate the saving of nature, especially if used cleverly, including by the sorts of people in this room. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola. You almost got me enthused about going to my 9th CITES conference this year, so that's saying something. Right, questions? Come on, there's a question somewhere. Yes, there's a question up here, just behind you.
I wonder what your views might be on a convention for rewilding. Based on, so I'll very quickly say, based on the fact that you have to intervene with kind of ruddy ducks and things like that, and the point that rewilding you do not intervene, how would a convention run on that one?
That's an extremely pertinent question. Funnily enough, I was interviewing for a policy post at RSPB the other day with all these bright young things coming along, and I asked them, if you had this post, what is the issue that you would most like to follow? And they all said rewilding, and yet it's not on the agenda, as far as I'm aware, of any of the conventions. So it is a big gap. I've no idea what the answer to it is, but it's clearly something that it would be worth thinking about. Thanks.
Thanks. Any other questions? Okay. Oh, yes. Just one down here.
Hi, thank you. I was just wondering whether you think that the international conventions are strong enough to keep UK legislation in place, even if we end up leaving the EU?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, and one that we should be thinking about, unfortunately. As I said, it's weaker than the directives, but if we do leave the EU, we'll have to get a lot smarter about using them. Yeah.
I think we don't want to think about that really, but yeah, there's another question.
Hi, Nicola, thanks. It's a quick follow-up to that. Would we still be bound by Bern if we came out of the EU, or is that just for the EU? So we would still have to follow the Bern Convention?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's encouraging.
Okay, I think that's all the questions. Thank you again, Nicola. That was great. Thank you.